beautiful and bright, Despina. Okay. Go for it, Wayno.
This is Talking Law on Radio 97. If you have a question for Despina, and we worked out we've only got 3 weeks left in this program for 2021, but if you do have a question, send it in an email to breakfast97@superradionetwork.com.au. That's breakfast97@superradionetwork.com.au.
And for this particular segment, we're going to do a bit of a recap on the COVID cases that have come out in the past year or so, even longer. And one in particular was the Lada versus Hazard case, which was very interesting and sparked some questions. So what can we learn? We'll talk about a few different cases, but what can we learn from that particular case?
Yeah, so it made headlines, didn't it? Because he was and is a paramedic, and he's also a member of local council. I think he was the mayor of a particular town in New South Wales, and he actually was able to obtain funding for his court case through social media to the value, I believe, of $250,000, which was extraordinary. So he took his claim to the Supreme Court, and what he was claiming about, and we've seen lots of cases this year, haven't we? We've talked about them, and we've seen cases with the Fair Work Commissioner in relation to employee situations. And now we're seeing cases emerging, and this is one of them, where someone wants to claim that the public health orders that we all know about they've been in place are actually invalid. So if they were declared invalid, then a lot of the things that have happened might have to be rewritten. So he took his matter to the Supreme Court. He actually had 3 barristers on his case, which is extraordinary, to say the least. But perhaps they were trying to get, lots of different areas looked at. But anyway, different areas of law. And these cases that have come about from COVID, we've talked about different areas of law, such as human rights, such as employment laws, such as discrimination laws. So there's a whole mixed bag in there. But in any event, he lost. So that's the short story of it. So the public health orders, of course, are still valid, and they're still in place, and they weren't declared invalid. But what was interesting here is the court said, and the message really is that the greater good is going to outweigh the individual. And there's a quote from the case which is very interesting for people to hear. And the court said this, that there is no comfort to a patient who is infected by the unvaccinated healthcare worker by saying to that person, well, you're just unlucky, you're in the wrong ward at the wrong time. And remember, here's a paramedic. So he was in the healthcare industry, and he refused to be vaccinated. So obviously he's right at the front line with people, being a healthcare worker, and he just refused to be vaccinated. And he based his claims on religious grounds and moral grounds and political views, and called the public health orders morally repugnant. But in any event, he didn't win, on the basis of what he was saying.
Yep, and it's been interesting that, as you mentioned, there have been a number of cases over the past 12 months who've tried to have a go at these various public health orders in different ways, but overwhelmingly the courts have come back time and time again saying that the greater good trumps individual rights and human rights.
Absolutely, and that came out in another case recently, Q Nurses and Monash Health. And people might remember that case recently. So there are a lot of nurses that were dismissed. And they refused to be vaccinated. So, and of course, the case, what the case actually said was that, well, you weren't unfairly dismissed, but particularly, this is what they've said, and that is that, yes, there are freedom of religious views and religious expressions, and we do have freedom of thought and expressions. We have those freedoms in this country, and that comes down to your human rights. But you see, what the legislation says is, yes, we have those freedoms. However, those freedoms are always subject to limitations to protect the public health. And that is the emerging issue that's come out in these cases, where people have tried to claim either that the public health orders are invalid, or that they were unfairly dismissed when they were told you must be vaccinated in a high-risk category, such as aged care, healthcare, childcare, and they refused to be. And all the cases so far anyway have said, well, they're not invalid. And no, your employer was reasonable to request that because you're in a high-risk category industry, and because of the laws that have come out this year because of the pandemic. And as you said before, it is about the greater good. It's about protecting the public generally versus perhaps the minority of a few that say, well, I don't want to be vaccinated on religious grounds or moral grounds, or I think they're invalid. So that's the message so far that's been coming out through the courts, and it's really interesting.
Yeah, because it really depends, like you mentioned there, what category you fall under in terms of being a paramedic or, say, working in childcare. If it was, say, someone working from home for a bank and then they got dismissed, they could have a different outcome in that court case, right?
Oh, absolutely. So it always depends, and that's what the courts have said. Let's look at whether you're in a high-risk category.
Other people are at risk.
Exactly. And to my knowledge, there's been no cases at all where someone was in an office job situation, whether you're a dentist, accountant, lawyer, or whatever the situation is, where you've got people saying, well, I don't want to be vaccinated, I'm taking this to the Fair Work Commission because of a situation where the employer is mandating that everyone gets vaccinations, and that they refuse to do so. So it's an interesting area. I think there'll be more cases coming forward, and I think there's some cases that we're still waiting on the outcome of those particular claims that were made through the courts. But certainly if it's an employee situation, we've seen the Fair Work Commission cases, which have not been made in favour of the employees to date, to my knowledge. And then you've got claims that are going through the Supreme Court. Maybe we'll see a High Court challenge in the near future about the public health orders. So we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah. And in a nutshell, I guess, Despina, for our listeners, what would you say you should take away from these cases that we've seen this year?
Well, I think what you can take away is that the public health orders were made, and they were made lawfully because there was legislation that allowed these public health orders to be made. So you're not going to have the Fair Work Commissioner or even the Supreme Court, for example, willy-nilly dismiss these public health orders that were in place that are valid. And I think that if there's going to be a challenge, it's going to have to be taken up perhaps on some other grounds, in the future.
Yeah, great advice there from Despina Priala from boutique law firm Priala Legal, answering your questions about the law as always. And if people want to get in touch with you directly, Despina, before Talking Law is up this year, where can they go?
Yes, they can phone the office 55291 294 and talk to myself or my lovely staff. And of course, they can check out all of the segments we've had on air on the YouTube channel.
Despina Priala, you can find it on YouTube. Thank you so much again, Despina. We'll talk to you next week.
See you then.
See you then.